David has this amazing promise from God over his life. But at a certain point, the pressure has just become too intense. Saul has turned against him and is literally out for blood. So David goes on the run. First, he goes to the priest, but then he winds up living among his enemies, the Philistines. Now, as we'll see in a moment, that rather than seeking God for direction, that by falling back on his own self-reliance, strategies for self-preservation, we'll see it never produces optimal results. Now, before we criticize David, remember, despite all of his failures, God says he's a man after my own heart. But it's a reminder for you and I that as much as we desire to be people of faith, that we want to have that confidence in God coming through for us, our reliance on God rather than ourselves, that there are moments, there are times where, whatever the circumstances, pressure causes us to fall back on our own strategies, solutions, self-reliance. But this is where we need to understand how God's grace, his mercy comes into play, and why repentance is truly realignment. Back to David. So what has he done? So again, rather under pressure, looking to God for direction, for protection, for provision. It's God's promise in his life. He goes to the priest. Now, they ask why he's there. And his response was, I'm here on the king's business. I remember years ago, a ministry leader who tried to spin it that, well, God was the king and he was there in God's business. But no, let's not make him something he's not. He deliberately was deceiving the priest, and it will have severe consequences a bit later. But from there, he winds up with the Philistines, again, his enemies. And then he begins to hear the murmuring, the rumors. They're not real happy having him there. And his solution this time is to pretend madness, scratching at the city gates, drooling until basically they eject him. Now, again, in both situations, we don't see optimal results. In fact, with the Philistines, we don't see God glorified. God's plan's not advanced. Nothing good comes out of it. But with the priests, it's actually worse. Because when Saul has heard that the priests helped David, he orders them killed. And when David gets word of that, he realizes it's his fault. That if he had never gone there, this would have never happened. Again, the consequences were severe for others. But we do have to fall back on and remember God's grace and his mercy. God has been highlighting to me recently Abraham, the friend of God, who also had amazing promises over his life and walked with God. Abraham did so many things right. But we also see where there were moments under his own pressure that he fell back on his own self-reliance. Specifically, we see several times, more than once, where when he was concerned, when he was fearful, that he told them that Sarah was his sister. And we know what happened at least twice. But when Abimelech calls him on it, what he says is, this has been our pattern. Could it have happened more than twice? But this is where God's grace and God's mercy comes into play. We do come up short. There are times we're under pressure. It's not ideal. It's not optimal. But there are times for all of us, we're under pressure. We fall back on our own self-reliance, our own strategies. And while they never produce optimal results, God's not glorified. They don't advance us. They don't promote us and push us forward. God's grace and his mercy is still at play. See, the religious mindset would say that to some degree, we've just disqualified ourselves. And again, it's not optimal, but it's understanding God's unfailing love. Going back to Abraham and Sarah, despite him, God protected them. He even blessed. And what we see is people began to recognize, even in that failure, the reality of the living God in their life. Back to David. When reality sank in, when it hit home that he hasn't been relying on God, and there haven't been great consequences, he wrote Psalm 34. And Psalm 34 is this amazing song of the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, and the blessing for those who put their trust in God. Now, did he write that as a psalm of repentance? Was it a reminder to himself that under pressure, God is our protection, our provision, our promise? Was it a form of repentance of his own, just realignment, repositioning himself to refocus on that God is the center of everything in my life? And even under pressure, he's the center of all the solutions, the breakthrough, and the blessings. My point is this: God is calling you not just to be saved, be one of his people. He's calling you to rise up in partnership with him, that you would be that living demonstration of his goodness, his faithfulness, and his blessing. You would be the conduit of his blessing into the people in the world around you. But when we set a standard of perfection that we can never maintain, we set ourselves up for failure. So it doesn't give us an excuse to come up short, but it's the reminder when we do, we have a faithful God, that when we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. That is the nature of our God. His enduring, never-ending love produces grace and mercy. But repentance, when we realize we've missed it, repentance is realignment, getting back into line with God's plan and his purposes for your life. That is the path of empowerment.